the following things are able to bring benefit. Before the bath, massaging the body with the hands, neither very gently nor again very roughly, until it becomes red. And then by firm massage, but not much, compressing the skin to make it dense and hard. And after these things, using moderate exercises. Then bathing, without spending a lot of time in the bath. And wiping off, like the previously mentioned dry massage. And after these things, anointing with a little oil and giving food. These were the words of Galen, the renowned Greek physician writing in the 2nd century AD, in one of the many passages in which he promotes bathing as being a healthy practice that contributed to both hygiene and therapeutics, or in his understanding, to maintaining bodies in good health and curing the disease that affected them. The passage also reveals how distant the Roman concept of healing could be from ours. Many of the ailments listed in medical literature may sound familiar, but the treatment, bathing, may not as much. Ailments such as fevers, inflamed intestines, liver complaints, small pustules, eye complaints, and maybe alarmingly, urinary and bowel problems could apparently be treated by bathing. There's actually very little evidence to suggest that baths were places of healing in the modern sense of the term. Very few surgical tools have ever been found in baths, and they may also have had a different purpose. Doctors are never mentioned among the various people being present in bath buildings, and we cannot link any particular room to a medical practice. If baths were certainly a logical place for doctors to practice, for they had a strong connection with health in the Roman mind, they had running water and they had large crowds, we simply cannot confirm doctors were present there. So maybe the greatest health benefit for the Romans going to baths was cleanliness. And even there, I would say that the idea that the Roman would come out of the bath clean is perhaps asking too much of bathing in Roman times. Water availability varied greatly between the largest cities of the empire, fed by several aqueducts like Rome, and smaller settlements relying on wells and rain for their water supply. Yet those smaller settlements still had bath buildings, as was the case for Pompeii in its early phases. An assessment of the water availability and requirements of a series of small bathing establishments in Oppida in southern Gaul, these assessments reveal how the water in the pools could only be renewed very occasionally, perhaps as unoften as once every other week. That the quality of the water left a lot to be desired is also made clear by the same doctors who recommend bathing in the first place. Celsus warned his clients to avoid bathing with a fresh wound, for this renders the wound both wet and dirty, which normally results in gangrene. The oil used by the bathers to anoint themselves, mixed with dirt and sweat, would also contribute to the general dirtiness of baths. Other hindrances to a healthy bathing practice could include the fumes that could leak from the furnaces and enter the bathing rooms, giving bathers headaches and dizziness. Finally, one of the inferences from the literature is that the ill and the healthy bath together, with implications that I don't need to point out. An edict by Hadrian tried to put a stop to the practice, but the extent to which it was respected is unknown. But so much emphasis needn't be placed on actual healing in baths. The practice of medicine in the ancient world was very open, mostly subsumed under the general topic of philosophy, and anyone who felt like trying could become a doctor without any authority vouching for their competence. Therefore, a treatment that required to participate in a pleasurable activity, bathing, was certain to be popular. And eventually, what was important was that baths were perceived to promote good health. Medical writers advised to bath according to a series of principles which depended on the ailment, certainly, but also the recommendations vary from one author to the next. The practice may have included light exercise to warm up in the palestra, for instance, or maybe warming up directly in a tepid room, in the tepidarium. One common aspect all the authors have in common is this need for a gradation in the changes of temperature, with a slow climb to a high heat, reached either in the caldarium or in the laconicum, which differ because one is moist heat, the other one a dry heat. And to finish, you go down in the temperature before immersing yourself in the cold water in the frigidarium. To finish, a good scraping with a strigil and a massage and an oil anointment was certainly the way to go. The range of practices is also increased by the number of bathing establishments all over the empire, which varied in size, in luxury, in the facilities they offered, and in their specialization. And the strongest association between health and baths is actually found in one of those specialized bath buildings, bath category, which is called the spa baths, which is the name globally given to bath buildings set on a thermal spring. Not any spring, but a spring that had specific physiochemical properties, generally linked to geothermal and volcanic activity. A bit west of here, in the aptly named city of Bath, hot water rose from a geological fault in the ground at a temperature of 46 degrees, with this orange color that you see on the screen, which is due to the iron dissolved in the water. Even more dramatic is perhaps the springs of Pamukkale in Turkey, where the calcium carbonate content of the water eventually created those wonderful terraces, travertine terraces. These waters came to be strongly associated with healing divinities who could grant good health to the visitor who asks for it. Many of these springs had been used before the Roman period, and eventually the addition of a bath building on top of them was simply an architectural monumentalization of the spring. These baths were also part of healing sanctuaries, and they cannot be considered separately from that context. They inserted themselves in a group of monuments, which included temples, maybe a theater, and certainly accommodation facilities. And if the baths of Bath are often depicted with the picture you see on the left, they were actually part of a sanctuary, a larger sanctuary dedicated to Minerva Sulis. And a visit to those baths was above all a pilgrimage to the sanctuary, which required performing a series of ritual activities such as bathing, but also offering of sacrifices to the gods, which explains why we found so many of those material in the spring, like gems, coins, curse tablets, where people were asking the divinity to intervene in their favor. Baths in healing sanctuaries, however, were part of a space that was outside the bounds of the Romans' normal lived experience. Reaching a healing sanctuary was a pilgrimage, not a daily activity, as opposed to visiting a conventional bath building, which we're seeing right now. And a visit to the local baths was performed daily by the vast majority of the Romans who would go there to spend time with friends and colleagues as well. In our world, which slowly emerges from the slumber and forced social distanciation created by the pandemic, I think we can easily recall how important the social relationship we have maintained during the period, how important they have been, or how dearly we've missed them. But in Roman society, were the framework in which these social connections and relationships could develop and were maintained. I cannot tell you how a typical Roman intimately felt when he was going to the baths. They left virtually no traces, and the number of experiences must have been as large as the number of people attending an establishment. But I can quote the conclusion of an experiment that was conducted by academics who built from scratch, using Roman techniques, a Roman-type bath building in Turkey. They built it and they ran it. And it's worth noting, before I quote their conclusion, that these words are the words of academics, architectural historians, archaeologists, engineers, perhaps among the most socially awkward of crowd if you put them in a bath building. The 6 consultants, and I quote, the 6 consultants took an hour-long bath, following roughly the Roman routine. And I skip that bit because you know it now. It may be worth noting the degree of camaraderie and playfulness that emerged during the communal hot bath among professionals who are normally critical, even cynical, of each other's views. The warmth and intimacy of the bath awakens all the senses and acts as a stimulant for a feeling of relaxation, comfort, well-being, and tolerance. Our shared bathing experience provided a rare insight into the thermal culture of the Romans and gave a clue as to why communal bathing was so important to them. End of quote. This passage also makes very clear how the sensorial pleasure would be derived from the bathing activities. All senses contributed to create a different experience that was not usually lived away from the baths. Those artificially created environments where each room offered a different set of conditions. They could be airy and large, or small and dark. They could be damp or dry, hot and cold. They could even be smelly, depending on the waters, if you had a sulfuric component. The sound component as well is important, imagining water crashing down from fountains. All these conditions gave the rooms an otherworldly atmosphere, all the more prone to divine associations. And on top of those social aspects, baths also offered for a portion of the population whose daily living conditions tend not to be mentioned in the literature which was written by the elites. For them, baths provided an access to resources and facilities they otherwise could not experience on a daily basis. Think about the availability of running water, which otherwise they would have had to go to the fountain or the river to have. An access to large, airy, brightly lit rooms, which were a welcome change from the cramped and dark living conditions of a large part of the population. Or simply the heat and the ability to relax in a heated environment. The Mediterranean may seem like a warm and hospitable place from here, apart from today, but outside of the summers, the heated rooms of the baths would have provided an enjoyable shelter from the elements. Seneca, ever the moralist, may deplore this luxury and wish for a return to the good old days of the Republic when one washed like Scipio in a little bath housed, cramped and dark in the old fashion, but his views were not shared by the majority of his contemporaries. Instead, it is this luxury, visible in the architecture and in the decoration, in the variations of heat and abundance of water, that made bathing a pleasurable experience. The physical beauty of the baths was one of their virtue. Floors and walls could be adorned with a wealth of multicolored marbles. The Hippias, the description of a bath building in the 2nd century AD, praises the use of marble in baths, marbles coming from Laconia, from Phrygia, from Numidia, with colors of reds and yellows and purples and whites. It also praised the brightness of the light everywhere. Even in less luxurious baths, as in maybe the Theban baths of Pompeii, the ceilings were still decorated with polychrome stuccos. It is also fair to assume that the enjoyment of works of art was considered an essential part of the experience of bathing at its best. The many remains of statues found in bath buildings, but also epigrams and inscriptions are a strong attestation in that favor. In the Bath of Caracalla, for instance, you're probably all familiar with the many sculptures which tower at 3 or 4 meters high. The highest of them, the tallest of them, were statues of Asclepius and his daughter Iria, hence the very strong health connections in the bath building. Similarly, in the Baths of Leptis Magna, we're in Libya here, the Frigidarium turned into almost a gallery with no less than 25 statues. The 4 orange squares on the plan on the left are healing deities, Asclepius, but all the others are a wide variety of statues. This wealth of decoration in turn meant that baths acted as museums, as art galleries, not in a separate, dedicated space like nowadays, but as part of the experience of bathing. However one wants to define beauty, this kind of beauty was accessible to everyone while they were performing one of their daily activities. And if the physical and social aspect of bathing, if the sheer beauty of the structures, and if the art on display was not enough for the demanding visitor, baths could also offer places dedicated to cultural and intellectual pursuits. The ambulatories, peristyles, and courtyards offered spaces for strolling and discussing literary or philosophical concerns, possibly prompted by the art they had just admired. The large baths of Caracalla in Rome included lecture rooms, and the southwestern exedra of the Baths of Trajan, pictured here on the screen, long thought to have hosted a library, actually contained marble seats for philosophers and rhetors, and could have been used for public lectures and by athletic associations. So I hope that by showing you the fundamental role baths had in Roman society, I hope I have not sounded too much like an apologist of Roman bath buildings, because they had their shortcomings. And in our Western societies, they would be unsuitable on hygienic, medicinal, and cultural grounds. And also, I have not even mentioned the fact that a pleasant and healthy experience of bathing was made at the expense of the health of the people who operated those baths, who often worked in less than ideal conditions. But despite these shortcomings, I think we can recognize how baths fulfill the function in Roman society that no single building quite manages to do in our contemporary societies. By caring for the bodies and the mind of the bathers, by offering them a place for socializing, for exertion and physical care, for intellectual stimulation and perhaps even learning, by giving them access to luxury and water displays and beauty and art, usually reserved for the upper echelons of Roman society. By all this, baths cemented communities, provided the Romans with an escape from the sometimes dire conditions of their daily life and toil, and contributed to the general health of both the individual and the society they were part of. It is therefore no wonder they were deemed worthy of mention on the epitaphs of several Romans who ranked them alongside wine and sex, alongside laughing and playing, as an essential component of a life well lived. I think we can empathize.
At a busy corner of Campo dei Fiori in Rome, a marble inscription commemorates civic works ordered by Pope Sixtus IV in 1483. Sponsored, so right here, a little hard to see. Sponsored by the officials in charge of Rome's streets, the plaque states that until that time, Via Florea and nearby streets had been, quote, decaying, squalid, and full of stinking mud, end quote. Now it exhorts passersby to admire everything in these gleaming places. The text attributes this transformation to Sixtus, whom it designates salutifero, the bearer of health. Rome had suffered over a century of neglect, population decline, and loss of prestige during the Avignon papacy and the subsequent schism of the Western Church. Following piecemeal efforts by his predecessors, Pope Sixtus IV undertook a comprehensive program of urban renewal from 1471 to 84. His interventions included rebuilding the Hospital of Santo Spirito in Sassia near St. Peter's. On the walls of its new infirmary hall, a fresco cycle closes with this scene. So in the lower left corner, the Virgin Mary and St. Francis present Pope Sixtus for divine judgment at the end of his life, while angels precede them bearing evidence of his good works. So they carry models of two churches, a bridge called the Ponte Sisto, and the hospital itself. These diminutive structures stand as a visual shorthand for the Pope's main targets for urban renewal: churches, infrastructure, and charitable institutions like hospitals. On this medal cast on the occasion of Ponte Sisto's foundation, Sixtus proclaimed his care for public things, cura rerum publicarum. This paper argues that he intended this cura as more than simply a symbol of papal benevolence, but rather as therapeutic or medical care for the city. He aimed at restoring the health of Rome's decaying urban body. The Hospital of Santo Spirito played a key role in making visible and tangible this corporeal framework. By healing Rome's physical body, Sixtus sought to renew its spiritual and political authority and to strengthen papal control over the city. The humanists and courtiers in his orbit promoted his enterprise with a rhetoric of renewal and transformation meant to justify often aggressive urban interventions. Papal bulls, eulogistic texts, and inscriptions like the one I just showed you conjured the filth, stench, and squalor of the city's public spaces. Rome was not a city, but a cadaver, in one author's words. But the greater its decrepitude, the more astonishing Sixtus's transformation. Quote, "You renew everything, you increase and restore health. Because of you, leader, everything is accessible, everything gleams," end quote. Both personal experience of illness and knowledge of essential principles of medicine shaped Sixtus's curative vision for the city. In 1463, the Pope, then a Franciscan friar, took part in a debate on the nature of the blood shed by Christ at the crucifixion. So it's represented in a fresco from the hospital here on the right. A striking element of his theological argument, as recorded later in the tract De Sanguine Christi, is his use of medical evidence. His case rested on the distinction between two types of blood postulated in medical theory since the 2nd century Greek physician Galen: the nourishing sanguis nutrimentalis, the nutrimental blood that flowed through the veins, and the thinner sanguis vitalis, the vital or spiritual blood carried by the arteries. In good humanist fashion, Sixtus cited the opinion of medical experts, both texts and teachers he had known at the University of Padua, which boasted the leading medical faculty in Italy. Galen and his medieval followers conceived a tripartite division of human anatomy and physiology. 3 different souls, the animal or psychic, the vital, and the natural, corresponded to 3 hierarchical systems of organs and functions, each governed by one principal organ. The brain controlled intellect, motion, and sensation. The heart, seat of the vital faculties, governed breath and the arterial flow of vital blood. And the natural soul, with its seat in the liver, was concerned with growth and nutrition. In particular, the liver managed the process of sanguification, or the conversion of digested food into the nutrimental blood cited by Sixtus. So if the Pope had read his Galen, and I've found evidence that he could have, he would have known that the ancient physician deployed a host of urban analogies to explain the human body. In De Usu Partium, Galen observed, quote, "the wisdom of the first man who likened the governance of an animal to that of a city," end quote, which is probably a reference to Aristotle. Sixtus would have recognized this trope from political philosophy. Architects were also exploring the analogy in their treatises of the time, like Francesco di Giorgio Martini's treatise, where we find this image of a fortified city in the form of a male body. Galen found in the body's interior passages a parallel with urban infrastructure. So he compares it to roads, aqueducts, fortifications. Sixtus flipped the analogy around, using it to guide his urbanistic interventions. His concern about circulation and communication among different parts of the city led him to make extensive improvements to Rome's street system. He cleared, widened, and paved existing streets and created others in the Vatican and Tiber Bend areas. So the capital letters here indicate streets where he intervened. He cleared, widened, and paved existing streets. I'm sorry, I said that. These newly unclogged arteries eased daily congestion, the movement of goods, and the flow of pilgrims among the city's churches, a number of which were restored by Sixtus. He restored part of the Cloaca Maxima, the ancient sewer system, and instituted regular street sweeping in certain areas. Cleanliness was a prerequisite for healing, and we see this also in the regulations of the Order of Santo Spirito of the hospital, in images like this one that show nurses cleaning the limbs and the hair of patients upon their admission. Galen had likened the stomach to a grain warehouse from which the veins transport wheat or blood to the public bakery of the liver. Sixtus similarly attended to Rome's supply of grain. He built the Ponte Sisto, the city's first new bridge since antiquity, to connect the neighborhood of Trastevere, a peripheral neighborhood but home to the city's main river port, to the markets of central Rome. As Carla Kivanian has shown recently, the bridge redirected existing transport routes and consolidated papal control over the grain supply. Another early project addressed water supply with repairs to an ancient aqueduct, the Aqua Vergine, and the restoration of its outlet at the Trevi Fountain. Perhaps Sixtus recalled Galen's comparison of the branching structure of veins, arteries, and nerves to an aqueduct that brings water to all parts of the city. Guy Geltner has recently argued that pre-modern Italian regimes engaged in what we might now call healthscaping, and he defines this as the provision of urban environments with the means to promote residents' health, well-being, and safety. Sixtus IV's comprehensive program of renewal can be understood in similar terms. In a 1475 bull, he asserted the connection between the health of the urban body and the well-being and growth of its human population. Rome's, quote, buildings have fallen into decay, and the number of her citizens has been diminished. We therefore earnestly desire to see her population increased, her houses and palaces rebuilt, and all her other necessities duly provided for, end quote. His understanding of the city as a body formed the conceptual framework for this systematic approach. The Hospital of Santo Spirito made this corporeal concept manifest. The institution had been founded by Pope Innocent III in 1204. It supported a broad charitable mission of hospitality to the sick, indigent, hungry, orphans, and pilgrims. Sixtus IV expanded and rebuilt the hospital, and it continued to serve a diverse population, despite the trend toward medical specialization in other 15th century hospitals. The Latin word for heart was cor, related by medieval etymologists to cura, care, but also to caritas, charity. Santo Spirito was the heart of Sixtus's urban body, chief among a network of charitable institutions he supported, in a monumental sign of papal munificence at the threshold of the Vatican. This says that Zoom quit.
You keep going.
Okay. The hospital's new public face was an immense ward for poor patients, constructed from 1473 to 76 by an still unknown designer. Sorry, I can't advance the slide.
Sorry. We can. Sorry, everyone. Technical difficulty. Hold on one second. Okay. Should be fine. Thank you to Johanna for being so professional.
No problem. I don't know. It's not. I'll just advance on the computer. Is that okay? There we go. Okay. The hospital's new public face was an immense ward for poor patients, constructed from 1473 to 76 by an unknown designer. The octagonal lantern at the center of its long north facade and the gabled east end with its rose window evoked ecclesiastical architecture. The nave-like ward is enclosed by an arcaded portico on the east and north sides. A continuous low wall that joins the piers originally closed this space off from the street. So it wasn't open, sort of an open portico in the manner of Brunelleschi's Foundling Hospital in Florence. The portico was reserved for use by the hospital community, and you can see some figures represented in this print. So this included patients who were close to recovery, and they could exercise and take the air there. Enframed by the simple but monumental brick arcade, caregivers and patients alike manifested Sixtus's curative vision to the broader public. Santo Spirito's long single-ward design departed from the influential cruciform plan recently introduced by Filarete at the Ospedale Maggiore in Milan. The perpendicular south arm, which I've highlighted in red here, was erected in the 1530s and always remained a distinct space from the Sistine ward. The Sistine-era plan did include two adjacent courtyards to it on its south side. The larger of the two on the west may have housed the order's sisters and the abandoned infants and children in their care. The neighboring cloister seems to have housed the brothers of the order, with private rooms for impoverished noblemen on the upper story. The arcaded cloisters suggest a monastic typology appropriate to the communal life of the order. In 1581, the English priest Gregory Martin described the hospital as an urban microcosm. He said, a little parish in itself for buildings and distinct rooms. The itineraries of pilgrims and other visitors to Rome invariably included a stop at Santo Spirito. Visitors could enter directly into the infirmary hall at the portico's center bay, and they found themselves below the lantern, face to face with an altar where daily mass was celebrated for the patients. In the 1550s, it gained this domed classical ciborium, represented here, which was designed by Andrea Palladio. These sacral elements would have reminded the Christian viewer of the relationship between physical and spiritual health, as they witnessed daily rituals of care at the sick beds along the walls. The cavernous height of the main ward, the Corsia Sistina, was believed to encourage the rise and dispersal of noxious air exhaled by the ill. In our pandemic age, I think we can understand the fear of that, aerosol spray. The high walls also provided a field for 46 fresco panels celebrating the hospital's history and Sixtus IV's biography. After narrating the early history of the institution, the cycle turns to Sixtus IV. So I'm talking about the frescoes up here, which are very difficult to photograph. So it portrays his early life and election as pope, and then over several panels tells the story of Santo Spirito's rebuilding. He visits the decrepit old hospital here and is moved to pity by the orphans he encounters there. They're represented down here in the corner. A scene of the Ponte Sisto then somewhat unexpectedly interrupts the hospital sequence. We see Sixtus extending a benedictory hand towards the industrious laborers on the bridge. Then we're back to the hospital for its demolition and here reconstruction. The adjacent west wall pairs scenes of the Pope visiting the hospital's new cloisters with the rebuilding in the third panel of the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo. As others have noted, the prominent Latin captions below each painting evoke the numerous inscriptions installed throughout the city to commemorate Sixtus's urban interventions. Text and image together invite us on a virtual tour of Sistine works that encapsulate his entire program of renewal. So those same works that we saw in the scene that I showed you earlier. The original Latin texts notably cast Santo Spirito and the Ponte Sisto as rebuildings, not ex novo constructions. Sixtus restored them from the foundations. Now, the architect Filarete had observed that a building, like a body, can sicken and die. But if it has a good doctor when it becomes ill, he writes, a master who mends and cures it, it will stand a long time in good state, end quote. He meant an architect, but in this case, the physician is the patron, Sixtus IV. And that physician is also the healer of the city, the salutifero and the urbis renovator, as he claimed on inscriptions and medals like this one. As an institution, a physical presence in the city, and most explicitly in its decorative program, the Hospital Santo Spirito manifested Sixtus's project for healing the broken body of Rome. As visitors stood within a living scene of medical care below the painted tableaus of Sixtus's care for the city, they were urged to see the relationship of the healing bodies in the beds to the urban corpus and to the corporate body of Romans and the entire Christian faithful. For Sixtus's renovation aimed at restoring the body in order to save the soul. Thank you.
Okay, so in this paper, I am going to use a case study from the medical world of London in the 17th century as something of a warning. This conference is dedicated to the idea that classical architecture can be a healing phenomenon, and I don't doubt that that is true. But classicism, when deployed in a healing or medical context, can also carry myriad other meanings. This much, I think, is true of the spaces of healing that we find in the early modern English capital. So briefly, how did medicine and healing work in 17th century England? Well, as you may well be aware, hospitals did not function as we know them today. They tended to be residential buildings. If you got sick in 17th century London and required, and crucially could afford, treatment, you were seen by a medical practitioner, generally in your home. There were potentially a number of practitioners that you could see, most of whom, with the exception of the dreaded illegal quacks, belonged to one of the professional medical institutions that controlled healing in the city. There were the Barber Surgeons Company, one of the livery companies who oversaw matters relating to bones and joints and carried out surgical procedures, not with a huge degree of success, it must be acknowledged. The Apothecaries Company, whose practitioners were basically chemists. They were involved in the production of drugs and treatments. And the College of Physicians, whose members were the elite of the London medical world. University-trained physicians whose services were generally reserved for the wealthy. There are some other organisations as well, but I will deal with these ones today. These three institutions were, more often than not, rivals. They competed over the right to conduct treatment, to administer drugs, to control the list of drugs that were legally sanctioned, and to claim ownership or to claim possession of medical stewardship in the city. These rivalries were exacerbated over the course of the 17th century when the medical world of London was hit by a number of crises, most obviously the Great Plague of 1665, in which these three institutions were all largely powerless in the face of a pandemic that killed nearly a third of the city's population, and the Great Fire the year after, when the apothecaries and physicians lost their headquarters and the barber surgeons' buildings were severely damaged. And this brings us on to architecture. For architecture was a key battleground in these intense rivalries. Before and indeed after the Great Fire and the subsequent rebuilding, all three possessed architecturally significant premises in the city, from which they accredited their practitioners, trained their apprentices or candidates, held lectures, prepared botanical and chemical treatments, and, in all cases, even in the case of the lofty physicians, administered some degree of charitable relief to the poor. In the rest of this paper, I will argue that we should view the buildings that these groups commissioned within the context of their rivalries, and that all three used architecture to make direct claims to their learning, their credibility, and their ability to heal. In particular, I want to argue that these medical institutions engaged in an architectural arms race in which the principal class of weapon was European-influenced classicism. The barber surgeons went first, and in the 1630s commissioned Inigo Jones, no less, to build them a major statement of architectural intent, their celebrated anatomy theatre, which we see here in a later engraving and a drawing actually by John Webb of the building. This is a well-known building, although like all of the buildings I will be discussing today, it no longer survives. It was demolished in the later 18th century. But this was the first of a number of anatomy theatres built in London by medical institutions in the 17th and 18th century. It was of course a venue for lectures, some public, rather famously, but in fact, majority of its lectures were restricted to the company and its apprentices. Here, this isn't taking place in Jones's Theatre, but here is a typical image of an early modern anatomy lecture taking place. This one is in the Barber Surgeons, but it's not in Jones's Theatre. But I also think that in building their anatomy theatre, and indeed, crucially, in commissioning Jones to design it, the surgeons were making a statement. It connected them to the key places of medical learning across Europe. It was clearly inspired by another celebrated building. This one actually does survive. Here is the late 16th century anatomy theatre of the University of Padua, which, alongside Leiden, were the two most prestigious university medical faculties in Europe. And here is the other key inspiration for Jones's theatre, the anatomy theatre at Leiden. This one does not survive. There's a reconstruction of it, but the original does not survive. In fact, a great number of London's medical practitioners, especially those belonging to the College of Physicians, but also some of the surgeons, had trained in either Padua or in Leiden, and in some cases in both. So I think that the building of an anatomy theatre in the 17th century was a declaration of the possession of European-generated medical knowledge. It was a statement that we are connected to the broader European medical world. And for what it's worth, seeing as we have our Swedish guests with us today, I think that's also what's going on in Uppsala when Rudbeck designs his anatomy theatre in 1663, alongside Padua, one of the only early modern anatomy theatres that survive. This again, I think, plugs Uppsala into a network of medical educational institutions. Back to London. Jones's Theatre, I think, started a competition amongst the medical institutions of the city. The physicians immediately responded by commissioning Jones's pupil, Webb, to design them a new extension and library in their premises in the 1650s. We don't know a huge amount about this building. This is probably a preliminary design. This is in Worcester College. It's a drawing by Webb. It's probably somewhere close to what the building actually looked like. We know that it did contain a space for anatomy. It may have contained an anatomy theatre, but it certainly had a room in which they did anatomy lectures in. It was also paid for by the greatest of their alumni, William Harvey. And I think this must have represented a response to the Surgeons' Theatre, the commissioning of an architect as fashionable as Jones's pupil indeed, to design a building in a clearly European classical register. But one of the reasons we know so little about this building is that it didn't last for very long. It was destroyed in September 1666, along with so much of the rest of the city. The Barber Surgeons' building, being on the outskirts of the fire, up near the Barbican, survived, though was badly damaged, and the Apothecaries Company also lost their premises, completely destroyed in the fire. In the aftermath of the fire, the architectural competition between these groups ramped up again. The surgeons immediately repaired their theatre and hall, and the apothecaries rebuilt their premises very quickly. This is a building that we don't know very much about. Again, it doesn't survive. It was designed very, very soon after the fire, so it's a very quick rebuild. It is designed by a city carpenter called Thomas Locke. Again, no longer survives. It's a handsome building, perhaps not in the league of the physicians and what the surgeons and what the physicians are about to do. But I think, again, it's a statement of architectural sophistication in the face of medical competition. And the building of this new home for the apothecaries seemed to have sent the physicians into something of an architectural overdrive. The physicians became acutely aware that they were the only one of London's medical institutions to not have a home by the early 1670s, and yet they claimed to be the premier institution in the city. So here is an appeal issued to the members of the college by the college registrar, Daniel Whistler, requesting funds from the members to build their new college, and he explicitly says, our rivals have already beaten us to it. We need to catch up. We see the proudly erected palace of the apothecaries. We see, too, the magnificently rebuilt theatre of the surgeons. So the physicians get their act together and commission this, which I think is the most, well, I'm going to say this is the most interesting of the buildings I'll show you today. Again, alas, not a trace of it survives. It was on Warwick Lane, just north of St Paul's. The physicians go to, again, one of the elite architects of London in this period, Robert Hooke, the famous scientist, but also surveyor to the City of London, and somebody who is involved in numerous architectural projects in the 1670s. And I think that this one, more than any of the others, directly used classical architecture to advertise the credentials of the college's practitioners. So let's have a look at it. Well, as you can see, it's designed around a courtyard with this bizarre sort of cyclopean structure forming an entrance pavilion. This is actually the anatomy theatre, as we'll see, and it has a courtyard with the principal college hall facing the entrance. Here is the plan. The plan you can see is constricted by the site. This is a fairly cramped site in a fairly cramped city. This is Warwick Lane. So the courtyard kind of, all on the outside, sort of squeezes its way onto the street front. And you can get that sense from a series of remarkable photographs taken of it just before its demolition in the 1860s. You can see how cramped it is, how sort of hemmed in it is by the street. Nonetheless, as we'll see, Hooke manages, by elevating the anatomy theatre, to create something of a statement, something of a visual statement nonetheless. I'll deal with the anatomy theatre shortly, but it sits above an entrance gate that leads into a courtyard. Here we have the main block of the college where their hall was, their official hall, their censors room, where they oversaw the processing of candidates for the college. In the garret at the top of the main block, there was an attic space for the drying of herbs. There were rooms for the college chemist. Here, we are told, according to the map, there was an entrance where the poor of the city could come and have treatments administered as part of the college's charitable work. Here we see the courtyard looking in the main hall block here with the little cupola that rises above it. The interiors were plastered and wainscoted by a number of important craftsmen, most of whom were sort of Wren City Church craftsmen. This is the wainscoting of the hall, which actually survives in the present Dennis Lasdon building. It's been rebuilt in the census room of the present college. But of course, the key feature of the building is its bizarre and remarkable anatomy theatre. Again, built on the Padua Leiden model, steeply raked auditorium seats. Above it, this strange lantern-like structure designed, Hook tells us, to maximise light, to get as much light into the building as possible. It is elevated above a little sort of octagonal loggia that acts as the entrance to the college. And in elevating the theatre, Hook and the physicians are able to make a significant statement on the skyline of London. Again, here are two very, very early photographs. Photograph of the college from the inside with St Paul's looming in Mary Poppins-like in the fog behind it. And this is a remarkable photograph, again from the late 1850s or early 1860s, which actually shows us that the College of Physicians was a fairly prominent feature on the London skyline, looking south from the north of the city into, well, of course, there's St Paul's. So it's a fairly sort of prominent piece of architecture. This it features on the London skyline. The physicians were proud of it. They immediately commissioned the great engraver David Logan to produce an engraving of it, which they then use as the frontispiece for nearly all of the publications they produce in the next few decades. Here is their famous pharmacopoeia, which was their catalogue of registered drugs that they issued every year. So again, they claim to control the drug market in London. They do so by publishing this catalogue every year. And the pharmacopoeias that are published every year after the construction of the theatre always have the theatre there as the frontispiece. It stands in, it's a symbol of the college. Likewise, when one of their members publishes lectures, the theatre is stamped on the front of the publication. Here is a publication of some anatomical lectures that took place in the theatre, and here is, again, the login, or a copy of the login, on the frontispiece of the book. But I think what this ensemble really adds up to is, I think, the most sort of explicit statement of European cosmopolitanism, if you like, on the behalf of a medical institution in London. Because this whole plan, the way the building is arranged, is clearly based on contemporary Parisian hotel plans. It has a cour d'honneur, a domed entrance pavilion in the manner of the Palais de Luxembourg, and a number of other prominent French townhouses. It has the cour de logis taking the form of the hall with its cupola. And we know that contemporaries recognise this. John Evelyn, the diarist, visits Hook's new building and notes that it was designed in the French manner, he tells us. And this, I think, is entirely consistent and in keeping with the aspirations and the outlook of the physicians in the post-fire period. Here is one of them. This is Charles Scarborough, who's one of the key forces behind the commissioning of the Anatomy Theatre. We know from Hook's diary that he is in constant consultation in the early 1670s with Hook. Here is his portrait in the current college, and we see him depicted in Rome, with St. Peter's in the background, the Dioscuri, his copy of Vesalius. This looks like a Grand Tour portrait, but it's not. I think this is a physician explicitly displaying his learning, his European-sourced learning, and he trained at Padua. Here is somebody making clear that he is part of that European network. Indeed, we're told by another of the physicians that commissioned Hook, Christopher Merritt, in a book, and he's again one of the people very much. He was the librarian of the college, very much involved in the commissioning. He writes a book called The Accomplished Physician in 1670, which is a kind of guide to how to be a physician. He tells us of how crucial it is for physicians to travel and to become aware of European culture. He says, as a picture is raised to the highest point of admiration by the variety of excellent colours, so the intellectuals of the physician are incomparably adorned with the addition of those various accomplishments his travels through several countries afford. Physicians should be cosmopolitan. This building advertises that fact. Oh, sorry. Oh, can I go back to that? All right. So the deployment of classicism by professional medical institutions in 17th century London was a clear indication of the cosmopolitan medical education of the company's practitioners. In a deeply competitive market, for that was what London was when it came to professional medicine, these buildings explicitly advertised the credentials of the groups that commissioned them. Here at least, classical architecture represented healing, but perhaps more importantly, it was also an advertisement for an institution and its members' qualifications to heal. In a century of plague and fire, healing was big business, and classical architecture was designed as much for profit as it was for prevention or palliation. Thank you.
So thank you to Konogan, Johanna, and Matthew for your excellent presentations. I think you really brought us through thousands of years of ideas and architectural languages of ideas of healing. Something that I saw as kind of a unifying thread between all of them, amongst all of the many intricate things you all spoke about, was this idea that the visual and architectural language of healing was visible and something that was recognizable in antiquity, in 15th century Rome, in 17th century London. Konogan, you mentioned that decorative programs and ornament. Johanna, this idea that there's the body, there's a real corporeal idea and theological underpinnings of what healing ought to be. And Matthew, this idea of this commercial aspect of healing, rites of healing. And I wonder if you all might speak a bit about the people that were being healed, those who had the right to use these spaces, the right to heal. Were those languages understood, do you think? I might start with Konogan. Actually, there's a microphone just there, if you just turn it on. If you could just talk a bit more about this idea of that visual language of healing.
So in terms of accessibility, I think the main point is that it was accessible for pretty much everyone. Every status in the Roman population could go to the baths. The question of did slave even have access to the bath is a difficult one to answer, but there's some indirect evidence that they may have in some conditions. Then in terms of decoration, it was not entirely about healing. The message of healing was not hammered in the baths. There was definitely that component with the presence of statues of Aesculapius, of Hea. The connection was clear and supported by the decorative program. But the decoration was going way beyond that, with sculptures of Hercules, Venus, emperors, certainly because of all the funding systems of the baths. So I think it was the healing aspect of the decoration was encompassed in a much wider program.
And this idea, I think, this struck me in both the second papers, Johanna and Matthew, that the physical spaces, the classical language of architecture here, is very much tied to, I think, religious architecture, ecclesiastical architecture. Matthew, when you showed this image of the Anatomy Theater with St. Paul's, they're both dome structures, and it's probably no coincidence that Hooke possibly was looking at Dutch churches as influence for that design. No, but if you think about, no, of course, but could you talk more about? Yeah, we can get into it. But what are the influence there that are coming from the church? Because there are, as you very clearly showed, images of Christ cleaning people's feet. These very religious undertones here. Well, not undertones or overtones, but possible undertones. Of course, there's this larger idea of cloisters and hospitals that feed into 17th century hotels. But would you maybe speak about that?
Sure, yeah, I think, yeah, absolutely, and it is overtones rather than undertones. And I think that I think they're showing the connection, I think, between, as I said, like the physical healing and sort of spiritual healing. Right. And so they have an altar at the center of the ward. It's visible to all patients in their beds. The cycle of frescoes. At one end, there's a scene of the crucifixion. So you're sort of meant to be thinking about Christ's suffering as you're suffering physically yourself. And then in the cloisters, you do have this sort of monastic tradition that's engaged in through the architecture, which I think makes sense in terms of the fact that it's a community. You know, it's the order is the order of the Santo Spirito. The caregivers were a kind of tertiary order. But going back to your point about the kind of people who were in these spaces, I think there was a wide range of people using and visiting and being treated in these spaces. And so the ward is actually specifically for the poor, the ill who are poor. If you were a nobleman and couldn't afford to stay, didn't have good accommodations, you would have your own private room in the cloister. But the large ward that was sort of the most public, both the most public space, but also as a place of healing for the poor, and then the pilgrims, visitors, the noblemen and other visitors to Rome who come and make a donation and inscribe themselves in the registry of the confraternity. So there was a kind of, I think, interesting cross-section of people in the space. And the frescoes spoke to both those groups of people. I mean, the captions are in Latin, but I think that the style of the paintings is relatively accessible. They're very kind of, it wasn't an iconography that was hard to understand or read. They're accessible images.
Interesting. And Matthew, you mentioned this idea too, that the visual language was something very well understood by people within the companies or Londoners more broadly.
I think so. So I think if there is religious precedent for the buildings that I showed, I think it's a sort of distant echo. I mean, in that courtyard of the College of Physicians, they've probably got Oxford and Cambridge colleges knocking about in the back of their head. They've also been to, many of them had trained in Padua, which is, of course, the University of Padua is sat in the middle of a Renaissance, a courtyarded palazzo. But I think, Evelyn says this is the French manner this building is built in, and they know full well what that entails. That means a courtyard with an entrance pavilion and a principal block. So I think that it's much more about sort of European domestic architecture, actually, than churches. Yeah, I mean, the Dutch churches are generally an influence on Hook's architecture in general, but I think here he's thinking France, just in the position of it, the way it's positioned. And he's also thinking practicality. I mean, the reason it looks so weird is because he's trying to maximize top lighting, which works, which he wants to do to display the body.
Yeah, well, the photographs were fantastic. It's a good find to see that.
Yeah,
great. I would like to open up a few questions here. If we have any questions in our audience. Yes.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. I have two small comments. One about the baths. I know in Budapest they have baths. It's very similar to the Roman bath. It's for relaxation, socialization, but in Sweden, and very beautiful. And many of the baths are like that. But in Sweden, it's more for sport. It's not at all fun to be there. It's very cold, and you have to swim a lot to get warm, And the other comment is in Karolinska Hospital, the old one, not the new one. We had a large fresco from the Old Testimony about believing in God, then you will be healed, like a placebo effect. Yeah. So that's really interesting. So this is the first thing you see when you enter the hospital. And the other thing, a question is for you, is about the hospitals when they built those in the old days. Were there any competitions? Or did they use the newest, the more modern techniques, or what was driving the architecture?
We don't know very much. As I said, we don't even know who the architect of the building that I showed was. This is roughly contemporary with, as I mentioned, Filarete's great hospital in Milan, which is, I guess, much more sort of avant-garde in its development of sort of techniques of care and ways of sort of hygiene and sanitation and things like that. And that was an effort also to kind of consolidate all of the medical facilities in the city in one large institution. So it's a little, what's happening in Rome is a little bit different, and we don't know much about the sort of history of the construction and whether there was a competition or anything like that. But there, I mentioned that the very high ceilings were connected with this idea of kind of trying to get out these noxious vapors, and I'm trying to think if at the moment nothing else is coming to mind as far as sort of the sort of technology or medical research, I guess. But does anybody else want to add to that?
Well, these buildings are commissioned by, these are fairly wealthy, elite London institutions, and they have plenty of links. I mean, Hook is, lots of the members of the College of Physicians are also members of the Royal Society, so they just know him through that way. I'm interested, actually, and I haven't done much research on the College of Physicians is the kind of thing I know about. I haven't done much research on the barber surgeons. I don't know how they managed to get Inigo Jones to design their building, probably with quite a lot of money. But by the 1630s, Jones is the principal architect of England. He's the Royal Surveyor. So they just go for the top. These are rich institutions commissioning elite architects.
Fantastic. Any other questions from the room? Yes, Nicholas?
Thank you. Those are fascinating 3 presentations. Thank you very much, even though Matthew is disappointingly not a member of the Royal Society.
I know,
but that was a great shame. This is, I think, it's probably mainly for Konogan, though. Matthew and Johanna do chip in as well if you want. Only, as rather hackneyed to say, only one theorist of architecture from the Roman period has come down to us through his, Vitruvius, through the one surviving manuscript in a Swiss monastery that got sort of picked up in the 15th or 16th centuries, a bit earlier. His principles, broadly summarised as firmistas, utilitas, venestas. Obviously, there's a lot more there, and he does talk about health and what makes for a healthy place to live. How did you see that? And I apologise if you touched on it and I missed the subtle reference. How did you see some of that theoretical writing referenced in the physicality and the ornament and of the baths that you were looking at?
So interestingly, Vitruvius missed most of the development of baths. His book is just before the turn of the millennium, and most of the examples I showed you are for 2nd century AD, especially 2nd century AD, when the wealth in baths reaches its paroxysm. So it is tricky to apply its theory to much later production.
So you don't see it referenced, they're not reading it, is what you're saying?
I'm not using Vitruvius as a prism through which to study those baths, because it wouldn't be directly applicable. But if you look at the more ancient baths, I think it would have found the Venustas in the baths through the decorative program, but also through the design of the most complex structures.
My question is almost the other way around. Sorry, I'll stop after this, I promise, which is not, can one analyse the baths through the prism of Vitruvius, but it's more, is there any evidence that the architects of the baths have read Vitruvius, or someone now lost to us writing similar things, or have they just gone off in a different direction?
That is a very interesting one, and I think that's exactly the nature of my project here. So could
come back later.
Better answer in a few years.
Thank you.
Fantastic. We'll take one more question, and then any further questions we can continue downstairs during the coffee break. This question here.
There was something like an experiment putting some competing academics in a bath and making them more agreeable with each other. Was it quite a controlled experiment? Was it repeated with more academics?
So the whole point of the experiment, when I say experiment, it was in the early 2000s. So we're talking about Fikret Yegül, who's an architecture historian, archaeologist, expert in baths, with a team, built a very small couple of rooms, one room, one caldarium, a small bath building in Sardis in Turkey. The whole point was to see the building process, and the operation was just the one-off experiment at the very end. And I don't think much has been done with that bath building ever since. It's probably decaying slowly as we speak. So the experiment was definitely about the construction, using Roman techniques as much as they could. It was made in the frame of an American TV show, so you also had to follow a series of constraints in terms of timing. They couldn't let the mortar set for the time it was necessary, and therefore when they filled the pool, all the water leaked immediately, which makes for great television because it's a small crisis. But yeah. I mean, I can refer you to an article published about that. I'm afraid I stopped before that. It doesn't say.
Fantastic. Well, please, let's all thank our three fantastic speakers again this afternoon. We will take a coffee break downstairs, and we'll come back for 2:45 for session number 2, Architecture and Neuroscience.